Hi, welcome to the National Critics' Choice Online News, and today we have a very special guest with us this evening, and that's none other than Dr. Maurice Lee. He's the Dean for the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Central Arkansas. And Dr. Maurice, thank you for joining us here at the National Critics' Choice.
Thank you for inviting me. Appreciate it.
And many of my viewers would like to know what drives your passion in promoting the American, African, and the Caribbean literature.
When I went to college, most of those literatures, both Caribbean literature and African American literature, were not taught in the canon. Most of the departments taught English lit, and they taught American literature. But under the umbrella of American literature, very few black writers were taught. And so graduate students and I really felt as though this should be a part of the curriculum. I was at University of Wisconsin. This was a period of the 60s when there was a great deal of student unrest. And because of that, I was involved with both student unrest because of Vietnam, but student unrest because of lack of civil rights in some of the universities. And the University of Wisconsin decided that it would start an African American Studies program. So I was fortunate as a graduate student to assist the late Dr. Darwin Turner in setting up that program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And we started that program, and I think my passion was, first of all, in terms of making sure that my culture was recognized in the literature. But second, my passion was in terms of helping to set up that program in Wisconsin, and I was a graduate student during that time setting it up.
Now, what are the differences in terms of language between the African American and the Caribbean? Has language changed?
I don't know if there's a difference in language. In some respects, you have to talk about definitions, because I think that in both of them, there's a sense in terms of what defines the literature, what defines African American literature, what defines Caribbean literature. Is it based on, and you talked about language, is it based on language? Is it based on culture? Is it based on geography? Is it based on where a writer was born? Is it based on critics? Because they have to define the literature as well. I find it interesting that most of the time it is based upon where the writer is born or where the writer considers his or her heritage. So a Caribbean writer can be born in England, but if they have parents from the Caribbean, when he writes literature, most of the time it's going to be considered Caribbean literature. An African American writer pretty much defines the literature as they write it, and that is, most African American literature is considered to be that of people who are descendants with an African heritage who write about African American life. And particularly they write about African American life in terms of how it is addressed in this society, in American society. I think that's probably been the focus of it, regardless of who writes. How are we recognized as individuals within the society? And so that's in some respect what defines it.
And has African American and American literature has been defined today in the United States?
Has it been defined?
Yes.
Well, that's a very tough question. I think it's pretty much defined by the writers themselves, but I often wonder what would happen if you went into a bookstore and you just threw all the books on the floor and there were no labels that said Chinese literature or African American literature or Native American literature. How would you know what it is? And often it is the context of the work itself. Writers get up in the morning thinking about themselves as writers, maybe not as African American writers or Caribbean writers or as Asian writers for that matter. But if they start writing, interestingly enough, that context comes out, that content comes out. And in most cases, from that writer, it comes out reflecting who they are as individuals.
What kind of future do you see in the African American literature, and the Caribbean and the American?
That's a tough question. I wish I had all the answers for it. What people don't understand is that American literature itself, as a discipline in the universities, didn't begin until after the turn of the 20th century. American literature departments as such didn't emerge until the 20s and 30s in universities. And they were developing their canon in response to the incredible weight of literature from England. So then to ask them some few years later, now you need to include African Americans in your canon, was difficult. For the future of it, I see that many of those barriers have been broken. You have someone like Toni Morrison, who has won the Nobel Prize. I think that that's clear that the African American literature has achieved a place in the canon, particularly since the 60s, that it never had before. So I think the future is good. Could be better, but I think it's good.
What kind of inspiration that you adopt when you first learn that you've chosen your path to write short stories, because you love to write short stories? So well, how did that happen?
Well, I think that identifying me as an established writer is a little bit of a push. I think that when you think about it, I'm established as an administrator and I write. But what really pushed me is that I think everybody feels that they have a story to tell. And I thought I had a story to tell about, first of all, being a young person growing up in Oklahoma. I think I had a story to tell about being an administrator, in particular African American administrator, and for me, predominantly non-African American universities. And so you have a passion to tell that story. And the difficulty is to be able to tell it objectively, to tell it without it being personal. Which is hard because I think that every writer has a sort of autobiographical streak in them, in their writing. And so it's hard to do that. But I think the passion was if I felt as though I had a story to tell. And I had a passion to tell it.
Another question one of our viewers would like to know is that what are the learning steps that you adopt in writing? How can they write a short story and perhaps even they could let themselves in winning an award? Is there a formula for that?
Oh, there are many great writers who have. You can go on the web and find their methods of writing, from Margaret Atwood to Kurt Vonnegut to James Baldwin, you name them. But I think that in terms of, first of all, I think you have to make sure that you have something to write about. And I think that topic is not one you choose in order to win an award. You choose a topic that you feel really reflects something in the human experience that is important. I think second of all, you have to have a discipline about it. I don't mean you have to write every day so many words. I don't mean you have to write in the evening versus morning. But I do think that you have to make a decision that you're going to write. And somehow figure out a time to do that. Virginia Woolf talks about having a room of one's own. I know many writers who write and they share a room. They don't have a room of one's own. But you've got to have the discipline for it. And I think third is that you've got to be willing to let others read your work and to critique it. So many students write, and when they give it to an instructor to read, they get very upset when it comes back. And there are a lot of marks on it telling them this sentence can be better, this image can be better created, your metaphor here is off, because they're writing from their heart and they feel as though you are criticizing them personally when you critique their writing. So you have to pull away from that and be willing to let someone look at your work and to assist you with it. You do with other things. I mean, if you're a math student, you let them assist you with math. You know, if you're a chemistry major, you let them assist you with chemistry. So if you're a writing person, you have to let someone assist you with writing. Be able to take that criticism. And I think that next you have to be willing to be vulnerable. Because I think writers are the least protected in some respect when they put things on paper, because all of them, who they are, is somewhat exposed. So you have to be willing to be vulnerable. And you also have to have patience, which means by the first thing you write may not be very good. The first thing you write may not get published. And so you have to have that patience. As for getting awards, I wish I had the formula for that. I know people who have written and did not like it very much and they got an award. I know people who have written and they thought it was the best thing in the world and they didn't even get to the short list. So I don't have the answer for that one.
Now, what is an inspiration? And how can one able to get inspiration as a writer?
In a way, that's a very simple answer for me. I think you have to read. I think you need to read works of good writers. I think you have to read a lot. I think you have to even choose authors once you've read things that you really like and read them a lot, because it is really an incredible teacher when you see the way in which people have put together ideas and sentences, words. And so it's different from reading a James Joyce to reading a Henry James or reading a Toni Morrison or Langston Hughes. You see that they will look at the same topic, but they address it so differently. And it's amazing how they do. So I think the best thing is to read, and read a lot.
And who were your heroes of the day? You know,
My heroes of the day.
yeah, that's right. The authors that you know that actually inspire you.
Well, one you wouldn't know, and one is a man named Mr. Riley, who was my English teacher in high school. Because he introduced me to literature, he introduced me to writing, and he introduced me to the importance of the written word. Next would probably be Frederick Douglass, because his use of the language and word was so persuasive in terms of a man at that time who was trying to get a sense of identity even before the Civil War. I think that he certainly would be a hero of mine in terms of language. Other heroes are, I mean, there are many, Langston Hughes, but in terms of American writers, in terms of other American writers, Henry James is one, William Faulkner, Toni Morrison. They are countless. And what happens is that the moment you think that you like this one better than the other one, another writer comes along. So what I like about writing is that you can always be surprised. You know, a book I have students read sometimes has nothing to do with literature. It has to do with education. And the book is The Education of Henry Adams. That book I often give students to read just for them to understand the whole process in terms of what it means to get an education. Because then they will also understand what it means to get a sense of writing as well.
What lessons can other societies in countries like Singapore, Cambodia, and even Myanmar can do to encourage people to read and write short stories? Because you have organized the International Conference on Short Story in English,
Right.
you know, and countries, you know, around Asia are emerging and they're experiencing a great demand to learn English. At the same time, they're also experiencing bookstores in around Asia are suffering from shortages of customers coming to the bookstores. How can these societies, you know, emerge and to encourage these people to read and write?
that's a good question and a tough one in this increasing technology. Because now I know that universities are pushing e-books. And so instead of students buying books, they're going and they're reading them online. And it may be convenient for students, but it's certainly not good for publishers. You're right, I direct the International Conference on the Short Story in English. It's a conference that's held every 2 years. We host one in Vienna in 2014, and we already have 60 writers signed up for that conference. But we started that conference, the conference was begun in 1988 in France with the express purposes of pushing the short story. And the reason for that is because the novel is so desired by publishers and editors and writers themselves. And we consider it somewhat the 800-pound gorilla in the publishing world. At the same time, in America in particular, the short story is the foundation of our whole writing, from Nathaniel Hawthorne to Melville, Poe. All of our great American literature began with great short story writers. So we felt as though it's important to push that and to have that as an area in which graduate students and professors would continue to teach. So that's why we started the conference. And we bring together both writers and scholars every 2 years to discuss the genre. And I will say that once we started it, for example, the call for short story collections in the libraries increased tenfold in that first 4 or 5 years. But, as you well know, technology has had an impact on that. And now we are having to accommodate that in some respect in terms of how we get our short stories on the website and so forth. It's a big discussion in our board right now, because we still prefer the handheld book in a soft chair with some nice cup of coffee close by, reading. I mean, that still is my preference on a Sunday morning.
Now, could you tell us more about your perspective on the Black American short story, Horizons Lost and Gained?
The first collection of, it was called the Negro short stories, was produced, I think, in 1966. And the first African American program began in 1968. And even though writers had been writing long before that in terms of short stories, before they really came into a collection and got into the canon was in the 60s. And so you had always been the writers from Charles Chestnut to Langston Hughes, James Weldon Johnson writing stories before that. But it gets into the canon in the 60s. And so it's important for that genre, I think, to emerge in ways that it has not before, because if you're going to produce African American short story writers, I think that you've got to have some models for them to emulate. One of the problems, I think, for the writers at that time was how to know that they were going to have an identity. So I think that the horizon gained during that period in which the African American short story got into the curriculum was in terms of being identified. But the horizons lost at that time because instead of putting them into the regular programs, they developed African American studies programs themselves, was universality. So that they gained a sense of identity in terms of being recognized as African American literature, but they also lost the sense of universality from the standpoint of the political education component in terms of being set into the regular curriculum. And so that still is a battle, quite frankly, I think that is fought in many respects. When you think about it, they would prefer having Asian American literature, gay literature, Southern literature, Native American literature, African American literature, than simply having American literature with none of those subheadings, and just including them all. Now that would be the horizon to gain. But that's we are not there yet. So wouldn't it be nice to go into a bookstore and it simply said either American literature and all those headings under there are just literature, universal literature, global, we like to use the word global literature, and then let you go and choose. I edit an anthology from the Short Story Conference from last year. And what I decided to do was just to put the books in alphabetical order, rather than listing this as Asian writers, which we had, African American writers, which we had, or Native American writers, which we had, or gay and lesbian writers, which we had. I just simply listed in alphabetical order, so that the reader would pick it up and then just have to read. They couldn't say, well, I'd like to go see something about what this person says about this. They just simply have to read the anthology. And they can stop reading it halfway through if they want, or even after the first story. But they they do not have a choice of selecting based upon titles. And to me, that's the best way to go.
What advice could you give to our viewers in your life experience that you have learned as an author, as a scholar in literature? Could you give them some advice, especially for the next generation who are aspiring to write? And what would be the 3 key things that you have learned in your lifetime?
That's a hard question. I said once before, read, but I won't say that again. What I will say to the young writers today is make sure that you have your own sense of identity as you begin to write. But number one, don't let ego get in the way, because that really does, from my point of view, almost destroy writing. You have to write with a great deal of humility, even though I know that it takes a certain sense of pride and ego in order to be able to sit down and say, I want to be a writer. That's number one. Number two, I think that you have to honest with yourself in terms of your writing capacity and your writing skills. For some reason, many people they know that they cannot do certain things in science and math, but a lot of people feel as though the only thing they have to do is pick up a pencil and they can write. It's also the case with a lot of art. People think they can just pick up a paintbrush and be a painter. You have to be honest with yourself whether or not you really have those skills or not. And if you don't have them, but you have the passion for them, then you have to go and get the skills somewhere. One of the concerns I know, particularly in terms of Asia and Europe, is the debate now about can you teach creative writing? Because there's a sense that it's something that is inspirational and it's genius and it's intuitional and it's something that just simply comes automatically. But it can be taught. And I think the third thing is be patient, don't give up. You just have to, stick with it. I think the hardest thing for writers is that simply because you don't get awards or you don't get published right away or you don't sell a lot of books does not mean that you're not a writer, and it does not mean that you don't have something to say. Sometimes you may have to be satisfied with that one book that you did that sold 500 copies is enough. And that's enough. And I think that's hard for writers sometimes.
Well, once again, Dr. Maurice Lee, thank you for sharing with us here at the National Critics' Choice. And can our viewers contact you for more information?
They most certainly can, yes.
Is there a website or?
Yes. I'll give you my website. It's Maurice L. I'll give you two. Maurice L. at uca.edu. and the other one is the Short Story Conference website, and that's www.shortstoryconference.org.
For viewers, those who are interested to make your trip to the International Conference on Short Story in English, you go to the website where Dr. Maurice has recommended, and you will be able to find out more information for all your travel needs. And once again, I'm Robin Stienberg. Thank you for joining me here at the National Critics' Choice with Dr. Maurice.
Thank you very much.